Good afternoon, everybody. Hello and welcome to the Faraday Institute here. My name is Paul Ewart and I'm the director here at the Faraday Institute. And it's my pleasure today to welcome you to our seminar. And those of you who are here in person and those of you who are watching online, you're all very welcome indeed. So today it's my very real pleasure to welcome as our speaker Professor Neil Messer from the University of Winchester, from the Department of Philosophy, Religion and Liberal Arts there. Professor Messer is no stranger to Cambridge. He completed his PhD in molecular biology here in Cambridge, and after that he went on to become an ordained minister in the United Reformed Church. And then after some time as a practicing minister, during which time he did theological training at Cambridge and King's College London. And then after serving as a minister in the real world, as it were, he moved into theological teaching and research at Mansfield College, Oxford, and also at the Queen's Foundation, Birmingham, and the University of Wales at Lampeter. He's been at Winchester since 2009, and he became Professor of Theology there in 2011 and served as the head of departments until 2015. So his background in science and his theological expertise makes him really eminently well qualified to speak to us today on this subject of cognitive science and religious faith. What, if anything, should Christian theology learn from the cognitive science of religion? Professor Messer.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's very good to be back here. And as you've just heard from Professor Ewart, the question that I want to try and answer today is what, if anything, should Christian theology learn from the cognitive science of religion, CSR? So CSR is a relatively young field of study which uses the tools and approaches of cognitive science to investigate religious beliefs, practices and experiences in terms of the working of the human mind. Justin Barrett, one of its founders, has listed 4 basic tenets of CSR. First, human minds are not blank slates, but have all kinds of cognitive biases and predilections, as he puts it, which means that they tend to work in one way rather than another. Second, some cognitive systems or mental tools are largely invariant across cultures. Third, these transcultural cognitive biases and mental tools, as Barrett puts it, inform and constrain religious thought, experience and expression. And fourth, cognitive scientists of religion are typically interested in religious ideas and practices that are shared by a community, a population, or an even wider sample of humanity, not those that are individual and idiosyncratic. Now, CSR investigates many aspects of belief, practice and experience, but one of the things for which it's best known is attempting to explain why belief in supernatural agents, such as gods, spirits, ghosts, angels, and demons, is so common in human beings. And CSR scholars identify various cognitive systems that are said to play a part in this. One is a hypersensitive agency detection device, HADD, a cognitive system that predisposes us to attribute events in the world to the actions of other agents rather than the interactions of merely physical objects. Another is a theory of mind, which leads us to attribute processes and an inner life rather like ours to other agents. A third is a tendency to retain what are called minimally counterintuitive concepts more strongly than those that are either completely intuitive or highly counterintuitive. So, for example, the concept of an agent who is invisible and all-knowing, but somewhat like us in most other respects, will make a particularly strong impression on our minds. And CSR scholars propose that the interaction of mental systems such as these means that human minds very readily generate and respond to and retain concepts of supernatural agents. Although the two fields are not identical, CSR has close links to the evolutionary study of religion. If CSR identifies cognitive systems that play a part in religious belief and experience, then it's natural to ask about the origins of those cognitive systems. The so-called byproduct theories are popular among CSR scholars. The idea of these is that religion itself was not directly selected for during our evolutionary history. Rather, it arises from the interaction of cognitive systems such as the HADD and the theory of mind, which were directly adaptive for our evolutionary processes. By contrast, adaptationist theories argue that religion itself was adaptive for our ancestors. For example, David Sloan Wilson's group selectionist theory posits that religion arose as an adaptation for reinforcing group cooperation. And some evolutionary proposals combine both byproduct and adaptationist elements. So I've briefly outlined what's meant by CSR. So what, if anything, should Christian theology be prepared to learn from it? Let me unpack that question a little. Christian theology can be understood in many ways, but one widely used definition associated with the medieval theologian Anselm of Canterbury is faith-seeking understanding. Christian communities hold certain beliefs, engage in particular practices, and share certain experiences of faith, which they take to be in some sense a response to God's self-disclosure and self-giving in the person of Jesus Christ. On this account, the business of theology is to reflect on those beliefs, practices, and experiences in order to articulate as clearly, as rigorously, and as coherently as possible the faith of the Christian community and its implications for Christian living. Now, the beliefs, practices, and experiences on which Christian theologians reflect are the same ones that cognitive scientists of religion aspire to explain in terms of the cognitive biases and predilections characteristic of our species. So my question becomes, in their task of reflecting on the faith and practice of the Church, what help, if any, should theologians expect to receive from the accounts and explanations of Christian faith and practice offered by CSR? Now notice the form of that question. It isn't a question about how science relates to theology, as though they were two separate entities which might, for example, be in conflict or be independent of one another, or in dialogue or integrated together. For a long time, of course, that question was the standard one addressed by scholars like Ian Barber, whose typology of science and religion I've just been alluding to. But for reasons I explain in my recent book, Science in Theology, and I forgot to have a copy with me to wave at you and the camera, but for reasons I explain in that book, I prefer to ask a different question, which is really about the sources of Christian theology. What contribution, if any, should CSR make to a Christian understanding of ourselves in relation to God, alongside more familiar sources of theology, like Scripture and Christian tradition? And in this paper, I want to explore two possible answers to that question. First, that CSR has no contribution to make to theological understanding. Second, that it does have a contribution to make, but its findings and insights must be critically appropriated into a theological understanding shaped first and foremost by the Scriptures and the Christian tradition's reflection on those Scriptures. These are not the only possible answers, of course, but they are answers that I find particularly interesting and worthy of further explanation. First then, should we say that CSR has no contribution to make to Christian theological understanding? One reason we might want to say this would be that we considered CSR more or less irrelevant to Christian theology. We consider that the beliefs and practices it seeks to explain do not correspond to authentic Christian experience, and the theories it constructs do not represent the authentic Christian faith on which Christian theology reflects. The theologian Marcus Muhling seems to be suggesting something like this, something close to this at any rate, when he claims that, quote, approaches to religious experience associated with the natural sciences, such as CSR, that focus on individual extraordinary experiences do not actually deal with the same subject matter as theological epistemology, but rather with something that would have to be seen as superstition from a theological perspective. His complaint is, I'm quoting again, that CSR assumes that religious experiences are special or extraordinary kinds of experiences. In other words, CSR identifies a particular subset of human experience as religious, such as the experiences of supernatural agents perhaps, and separates these off from everyday experiences that are not considered religious. The religious forms of experience are then given cognitive scientific explanations as products of cognitive systems such as the hypersensitive agency detection device. But according to Muhling, this way of defining from the very outset what is religious and what is not revives a separation between sacred and secular that the Protestant reformers rejected. Christian experience, he insists, refers not or not only to the extraordinary and supernatural, but to ordinary everyday experiences. I'm quoting again, saying grace at the table, giving an evening prayer, talking with a fellow Christian about her everyday problems, participating attentively or inattentively in a service, performing mystical prayer or meditation are all acts and experiences expressing exactly the same religious value, if there is indeed something like religious value at all. End quote. Now, it might not be too difficult for a cognitive scientist of religion to respond to this critique by pointing to CSR studies that have investigated the ordinary everyday practices of believers and communities. However, Muhling seems to be suggesting that there is something fundamentally problematic about moves that CSR cannot avoid making, identifying certain kinds of activity or experience as religious, separating them out from those not considered religious, and making them the objects of particular study using cognitive science approaches. And again, some CSR scholars might want to contest even that claim, but that seems to be Muhling's critique. He's not objecting to empirical studies as such, nor to the fact that these studies may generate criticisms of religion, which he welcomes. The problem is rather that in defining a priori what does and does not count as religious, and separating religious from ordinary experiences, CSR defines religion in a way that at best gives a very distorted image of Christian faith and life. Muhling's worry might find some support from a rather different quarter in the historical analysis of Peter Harrison. In his book, The Territories of Science and Religion, Harrison argues that the very idea of a science of religion is only possible thanks to what he calls a remarkable change in the understanding of both religion and science that can be traced back to the early modern period. In the ancient and medieval worlds, scientia and religio both referred primarily to inner dispositions or virtues, both of which were directed towards fulfilling the ends, tele, of human beings. For Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, religio was a moral virtue related to justice, concerned with giving God the worship that was God's due. Now, of course, it had an outward aspect in actions such as offerings, tithes, and vows, but these were secondary to the inward aspect of devotion and prayer. According to Harrison, the modern concept of religions in the plural as distinct systems of propositional beliefs and practices did not exist in pre-modern understanding. Following Aristotle, Aquinas regarded scientia as one of the intellectual virtues, directed towards fulfilling our natural inclination to seek knowledge. As an intellectual virtue, scientia was concerned with deriving truths from first principles. It could also refer to a systematic body of knowledge derived in this way, and Aquinas and other medieval thinkers did distinguish a number of different scientia. But again, the emphasis here is on scientia as an inner quality or habit of mind that made one, in Harrison's words, adept at drawing scientific conclusions from general premises. Now, if science and religion were understood in this way, as inner qualities or dispositions, then it wouldn't make much more sense to talk about a science of religion than it would to speak of a courage of justice or something like that. However, according to Harrison, a dramatic shift in the understanding of these concepts began in the early modern period following the Reformation. He identifies various influences that helped bring about this shift. One was the Reformers' rejection of medieval scholasticism with its Aristotelian roots. Related to this was a growing scepticism that human minds were naturally inclined towards knowledge and truth, as Aristotle and Aquinas taught. Since the Reformers emphasised the corrupting effects of sin on the human intellect as well as the will. If human minds were clouded by the fall, then true knowledge and understanding of nature would not come naturally to them. It would have to be gained by means of investigation and experiment. And these, claimed early modern advocates of science, like Francis Bacon, were at least partly able to reverse the effects of the fall. And turning to religion, Harrison identifies one important influence as the Reformers' doctrine of grace. This made Protestants hostile to the idea that humans, by their own efforts, could develop the ability to worship God rightly. That idea smacked too much of salvation by works, and the belief that humans have the capacity to make ourselves good. Along with this shift came a growing emphasis on knowledge and understanding of the faith, which led to a new kind of emphasis on the use of educational tools such as catechisms to instruct believers in the propositions of their faith. A person's knowledge of and assent to the doctrines of their faith came to be seen increasingly as outward signs of their inner faith and devotion. Now, as Harrison emphasises, this didn't mean inner faith and piety were ignored or their importance for true religion denied. It's simply that it became possible to distinguish between the inward and outward expressions of religion, and increasingly to define religion by its outwardly observable beliefs and practices. This in turn made it possible to distinguish between different religions, in the plural, with different beliefs and practices. In short, the process that Harrison attributes to the early modern period is a reification of both science and religion, concepts which had referred primarily to inner qualities or habits of mind were gradually turned into things, bodies of propositional knowledge and sets of distinctive social practices. Science comes to be understood as a distinctive kind of social practice that aims to understand natural phenomena by means of investigation and experiment, and religion as an observable phenomenon defined by the beliefs that people profess and the practices they engage in. It then becomes thinkable, in a way that Harrison says it wasn't before, that science can use its methods to investigate and explain that human phenomenon known as religion. Well, what has this long historical detour to do with the contribution of CSR to Christian theology? Recall that I raised earlier the possibility that the account of religion generated by the methods and approaches of CSR might be so different from Christian self-understanding that CSR would give, at best, a highly distorted picture of Christian faith and practice. In that case, I suggested, it might turn out to have nothing useful to contribute to a Christian theology conceived as faith-seeking understanding. Harrison's historical analysis offers two reasons for entertaining that possibility. And I should emphasise that Harrison is only responsible for the historical analysis, not for the rather wayward speculations that I'm attaching to it. But first, if he's right, Christian self-understanding was largely formed in contexts in which the modern concept of religion was unknown. It's not found in the New Testament, nor in the writings of many of the most formative thinkers for the Western Christian tradition, such as Augustine and Aquinas. Even the Reformers, who helped set in train the shifts of understanding which gave rise to this modern idea of religion, did not have this notion fully formed. When Calvin writes about true religion, he means something more like the older sense of piety and devotion. So if CSR scholars treat Christianity as a religion in this modern sense, and seek to understand and explain it as such, perhaps the accounts they come up with will be so far removed from the self-understanding of Christian believers and communities formed by that historical tradition that they'll have little to offer to theologians whose business is to reflect rigorously and critically on that Christian self-understanding practice. Second, and this might connect back in some way to Muelling's critique, Harrison argues that the scientific study of religion only becomes possible once a religion can be understood, largely or entirely, as a system of outward beliefs and practices, because these are empirically observable in a way that the inner qualities and dispositions are not. He makes this point with reference to David Sloan Wilson, who uses catechisms as his primary data for constructing his evolutionary theory of religion, precisely because they are, quote, measurable aspects of the world. But this raises the possibility that if you define religion in terms of what you can observe and measure, you write out of the script some of the aspects that are most central and identity-giving to that faith tradition itself. Now, CSR, unlike Wilson's evolutionary account, does attempt to study inward attitudes, experiences, and dispositions. But is there still a risk that in operationalising these elusive aspects of inner life in order to measure and study them, it will end up oversimplifying and distorting them? My reading of Harrison and Muelling then, I should emphasise again, it's just my reading. They're not to be held responsible for this. My reading of Harrison and Muelling then raises the question whether a CSR account of Christian religion will be so distant from the self-understanding of Christian believers and communities that it has little or nothing to offer to a Christian theology whose business is to reflect on that self-understanding. If theologians allow their thinking to be shaped by CSR, is the result more likely to be distortion or confusion than illumination? If so, then there's no reason to deny the validity of CSR as a research field in its own right. But Christian theologians, when they're doing their theological work, should leave it well alone. In the end, I do not think this is the case. I think that Christian theologians can benefit from an engagement with CSR. However, the concerns that I've raised, drawing on Harrison and Muelling, suggest that in engaging with CSR, Christian theologians should handle its findings, its theories and its claims carefully, critically, and in quite particular ways. Let me outline my reasons for favouring careful critical engagement rather than non-engagement. First, I should acknowledge that some of the critical remarks I've made about Muelling and Harrison could be challenged to some extent by cognitive scientists of religion. A CSR scholar could respond, for example, that CSR is not wedded to any particular definition of what counts as religious, Justin Barrett has even wondered aloud on one occasion whether CSR would get on better if it jettisoned the concept of religion altogether and just investigated particular phenomena ad hoc. A CSR scholar could also respond that it is interested in everyday and communal expressions of religion, as well as extraordinary individual experiences, that it can and does study inner attitudes, dispositions of experiences, as well as outwardly observable features of religion. And such responses could certainly qualify my claim about the distance between CSR and Christian theology. But mainly I want to pursue another line of thought, which starts with the observation that the history narrated by Harrison is, to a large extent, a Christian history. The key shifts in understanding in the early modern period that made a science of religion possible were the work of Christian scholars, theologians, philosophers, and others. What Harrison is suggesting, and he is not alone in this, is that the moves these Christian thinkers made turned out to have far-reaching consequences. What they did with the best of intentions stored up a whole lot of trouble for their successors. The 20th century Protestant Karl Barth, who you can see on the slide there, would probably have concurred that the history of modern theology stored up trouble for those who came after. Excuse me. Even if his account of what stored up the trouble might have differed in some respects from Harrison's. Barth's uncompromising theological critique of religion, not to say his apparent unwillingness to engage theologically with the natural sciences, might make him seem an unpromising dialogue partner for the conversation that we're having today. However, in the remainder of this paper, I'll argue that his engagement with the 19th century philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach and his critique of religion more broadly offer helpful pointers for theologians wanting to engage carefully and critically with CSR. This isn't a matter of following Barth uncritically, rather of thinking with him and perhaps thinking beyond him. First, Barth on Feuerbach. Ludwig Feuerbach is well known for his so-called reduction of theology to anthropology. His argument that religion is the product of human experience, aspirations, and desires, and the Christian God is no more than the infinite projection of those experiences, aspirations, and desires. As he put it in his book, The Essence of Christianity, the divine being is nothing else than the human being, freed from the limits of the individual man. Now, Barth engages with this Feuerbachian critique at various points in his career for different purposes, but what I mainly have in mind is the way he responds to it in some of his writings from the 1920s. While he's certainly critical of Feuerbach, Barth also praises him for seeing more clearly than most of his contemporaries a fundamental weakness of 19th century Protestant theology. For Barth, the only possible starting point for theological reasoning is God's self-disclosure to humanity in and through Jesus Christ. And he sees in Feuerbach a warning about the danger of starting anywhere else. If we start from our own experience and try to build our theology on that basis, we may think that we're speaking about God, but we shall really only be talking about humanity in a loud voice, to paraphrase another famous Barthian soundbite. Barth's engagement with Feuerbach also supports his theological critique of religion, to which I've already alluded. In essence, Barth's critique of religion is that it represents a human effort to know God and justify ourselves before God. This amounts to unbelief or faithlessness, Unglaube in German. So there's another famous Barthian soundbite religion is unbelief, Unglaube. A refusal to receive revelation and saving grace as God's gift to us. Human religiosity, Barth thinks, is a failure to acknowledge that we can only know God insofar as God reveals God's self to us in Jesus Christ, and we can only be justified and saved through Christ's life, death, and resurrection. As a refusal of God's grace, religion stands under divine judgment. Now, many of Barth's readers have seen this, understandably enough, as the worst kind of Christian exclusivism and triumphalism towards other faiths. It might also seem to discourage theologians from taking an interest in the scientific study of religion. But these judgments, I think, would be simplistic and one-sided. They fail to do justice to the nuanced and dialectical character of Barth's account. In giving a more complete picture, the first thing to notice is that Barth is not directly addressing 21st century questions about how Christians should relate to people of other faiths, or for that matter, about what theologians should make of CSR. His main concern is, in Joshua Ralston's words, religion as a category in 18th and 19th century theology and philosophy. In other words, his focus is more on the kind of historical development in the concept of religion mapped by Harrison and the questions and challenges put by critics like Feuerbach than it is on the agenda of the 21st century theology of religions, or for that matter, CSR. Consistently with this focus, Barth is explicit that his critique is first and foremost directed at Christianity as a religion. Christianity is a religion, like any other religion, engaged in human efforts to know God and justify ourselves before God. And as such, Christianity comes under the judgment of God's word. However, this is only one side of Barth's account. He also thinks Christianity is the true religion. But this is emphatically not because of any inherent superiority over other religions. It is only by God's grace. God elects Christianity, says Barth, to be a means of divine revelation. So we have this nuanced and two-sided picture in which Christianity is simultaneously a religion that stands under divine judgment and, through grace, a means by which God is made known to humanity. Ralston and others suggest that it's possible, using Barth's approach, to go beyond Barth in taking seriously the possibility of divine revelation in other religious traditions, though that's not our main focus today. What I'm suggesting today is that Barth's engagement with Feuerbach and his nuanced theological critique of religion can first alert us to some ill-advised ways of trying to engage theologically with CSR, and second, indicate some wiser and more fruitful directions for such engagement. First, the ill-advised ways. In his book, Cognitive Science, Religion and Theology, Justin Barrett proposes that CSR can support what he calls a universal natural theology. That is, a defence of religious belief based only on reason and evidence from the natural world, without appealing to special divine revelation. His argument, in brief, is that, first, our natural cognitive processes generate natural religious beliefs. Second, we're entitled to assume that our natural cognitive processes are generally reliable, in the absence of particular reasons to think that they're not. Third, therefore, we are entitled to regard natural religious beliefs as justified until we are given specific reasons to be suspicious of them. Barrett's argument faces sceptical challenges from psychologists and philosophers who argue that CSR shows the cognitive processes generating natural religious beliefs to be epistemically unreliable. Although he intends the second premise in that argument to answer the challenge by shifting the burden of proof onto the skeptics, it seems to me that they are likely to get the better of this argument. If byproduct theories are correct, then the cognitive systems that generate religious belief and experience are evolved in response to selection pressures that had nothing to do with religion. We might expect these cognitive systems to be broadly reliable in telling us about the natural phenomena that they evolved to deal with. But it's less clear why we should expect them to be reliable in telling us about the existence or otherwise of supernatural agents. Moreover, knowing that we have a cognitive bias in favour of supernatural explanations for natural phenomena, while it doesn't of course disprove those supernatural explanations, does give us additional grounds to be suspicious of them. If we find supernatural explanations to be intuitively plausible, that could be because of our cognitive biases, rather than because of the strength of the evidence or the arguments in their favour. The CSR-based sceptical challenge then suggests that Christian theologians would be unwise to try and use CSR as the basis for a universal natural theology or a Christian apologetic. This doesn't mean that the phenomenon of natural religion, as described and theorised by CSR, is theologically irrelevant. Recall how Barth argues that religion in the form of Christianity can be taken up by God's grace and used as a means of God's revelation. Pressing this thought further than Barth did, in a somewhat similar vein to Joshua Ralston, if our faith in God rests on other foundations, we might have reason to think that the natural phenomenon of religion could, by God's grace, be taken up and used as a means of God's self-disclosure to humanity. In other words, a CSR account of religion could fit well with what Barrett and others call a confessional natural theology, an engagement with scientific findings as part of an exercise in faith-seeking understanding. If religion is understood in this nuanced dialectical way, as a faithless exercise in self-justification before God, but at the same time, by God's grace, a possible means of revelation, this ought to motivate, I suggest, theological interest in the study of it, including CSR. So let me briefly outline 3 examples of how this might work. And having just been somewhat critical of Justin Barrett's universal natural theology proposal, it's only fair to acknowledge that these suggestions are indebted to other proposals that he also makes. First, Barrett draws attention to the Calvinist idea of the sensus divinitatis, a natural knowledge of God or seed of religion implanted in the human mind by our Creator. He suggests that CSR can support this idea of a sensus divinitatis and enable us to understand it more fully. Now, Calvin is highly optimistic about what this seed of religion can do for us. Because of human sin, he thinks, scarcely 1 in 100 is found who cherishes it in his heart, and not one in whom it grows to maturity. 4 centuries later, Barth cites this negative view in support of his own critique of religion. But even in this limited and negative way, the theological anthropology, a Christian account of what it is to be human, will include an account of human being as religious being. In the spirit of faith-seeking understanding, CSR might help theologians understand more fully what this looks like. Second, another famously gloomy remark from Calvin. The human mind is a perpetual factory of idols. Now, of course, when the Christian tradition refers to idols, it doesn't only or even primarily mean images made of wood or stone, but also the distorted images of God that we construct in our minds and our God talk. So this remark of Calvin's can be read as a reflection on how readily human minds construct false and distorted images of God. And again, Christians would do well to read it first and foremost as a critical reflection on the distortions to which they and their communities are prone. It's a source of perplexity and frustration to many Christian pastors, preachers and teachers that Christian people who've put their faith in the freely given love of God in Jesus Christ find it so easy to carry images of God in their heads that are at odds with the good news they say they believe in, sometimes with quite pastorally damaging results. And here the CSR account of theological incorrectness might helpfully come into play. CSR scholars such as Barrett and Jason Sloan have investigated various of the mismatches between what people say they believe and what they actually believe. These can be understood in terms of the cognitive biases and predilections, to use that phrase of Barrett's again, in terms of the cognitive biases and predilections that make it more difficult to believe and retain some theological ideas than others. Such a CSR-informed understanding of theological incorrectness could be of value in informing the practice of preaching, Christian education, and pastoral care. But this line of thought leads me then, thirdly, to turn the spotlight onto myself and my theological colleagues. We theologians are, of course, human beings with the same cognitive biases as others, and the same predilections for what Barth calls religion as faithlessness. It's all too easy for these cognitive biases and predilections to distort our theological reasoning, so that our work becomes a less adequate response to revelation, a less truthful exercise of faith-seeking understanding. And CSR in that case could be a helpful ally in developing a critical self-awareness about at least some of the biases that can compromise our own theological work. So I began by asking the question, what, if anything, should Christian theology learn from CSR? I've considered reasons for thinking that it might have nothing to learn, that CSR is irrelevant to Christian theology, or that its notion of religion is so distant from Christian self-understanding that it's more likely to distort or mislead than illuminate Christian theology. I've argued that this is not the case. Theologians need not and should not avoid engaging with CSR. They do, however, have good reason to appropriate CSR insights carefully and critically into a theological understanding formed primarily by the Scriptures and the Church's history of reflecting on those Scriptures. And for an example of how to go about this, I've tried to learn from Karl Barth's engagement with Feuerbach and from Barth's wider theological critique of religion. I've suggested that Barth sounds a further cautionary note against trying to use CSR as a foundation for Christian faith, apologetics, or theology. But that carefully and critically appropriated, insights from CSR could be of real value in informing the theological work of faith-seeking understanding. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Neil. That was a really challenging talk, really tackling some of the big issues in relating CSR to theology in a very profound way. Thank you very much indeed. And you've raised, I'm sure, a number of questions. I wonder if any are going to come in online, and while people are tapping away there, perhaps I can use my chairman's prerogative and lead off with one of them, and that is that I come to this subject as a physical scientist rather than as a neuroscientist or a cognitive scientist. But I've always been, as many physicists, intrigued by the very fact that we can understand nature, that the world is intelligible to our reasoning capacities. And so I wonder, does CSR have anything to say about this apparent coincidence that we are able to understand the physical world in terms of what it might say about the existence of a mind that produces the ordinariness that we can discern with our rationality?
Thanks for the question, Paul. I think CSR as such wouldn't speculate about the existence of a mind that's responsible for our rationality, or in which our rationality participates. Obviously, that's a theological speculation that some people might want to build on CSR. CSR itself, of course, would try and stay strictly neutral about those questions, or even some CSR scholars I've suggested would even use CSR as a basis for scepticism about that kind of claim. And some Christian theologians and Christian apologists might certainly want to press that kind of argument, and might want to say, well, the fact that we have minds that make us capable of understanding the physical world does point to some kind of rationality underpinning the universe, as it were. Again, for the reasons I outlined in my talk, I'd be very wary of pursuing that line of thought, because, again, trying to build some kind of natural theology on the basis of a scientific understanding of our own minds and how they work, just as trying to build some kind of natural theology on the basis of an understanding of the physical world. For the kind of theological approach I've been advocating is likely to end up talking about projections of ourselves rather than talking about the God of Christian faith. If we come to this question from a basis of Christian faith, if we believe not because of a kind of natural theological argument, but for other reasons, because we've put our trust in God's revelation in Christ, then we might certainly want to discern the hand of God in the order of the universe, and in the fact of our being creatures who are capable of understanding that. You can say that from a prior stance of faith, if you like, but I think the argument has to be that way around.
But just follow that on to engage with large criticism and his elevation of revelation over reason, in a sense. If we find by our experience that our rationality allows us to understand nature, and by empirical research and evidence-based reasoning, so that validates our reason at that level, we can use the same reasoning processes to make projections and theories in what we might call the religious sphere that would be no less valid.
In the course of his dispute with Feuerbach, or dispute with Feuerbach's writings, says part of the problem that 19th century Protestant theology got itself into was that it didn't take seriously enough the Calvinist slogan "Infinitum non capax infinity," the finite is not capable of the infinite. We may have creaturely minds that are capable of understanding creaturely things with a certain degree of reliability. Those minds, Barth will say, and I concur with this, that those minds are still liable to be clouded and distorted by our sinfulness in various different forms that it takes. But our creaturely minds may well be capable to an extent of understanding the creaturely world. But God is wholly other. God is wholly transcendent of the physical world. And the idea that our finite minds can grasp the infinite, Barth says, is just an illusion.
And the danger of us leading us down a theological rabbit hole here, but it's just an interesting thought that we use the same reason to interpret Revelation, and so we have to understand God's revelation to us, even through Jesus Christ, by the use of our minds. But perhaps I should open up the discussion to one of our online questioners who asked this. In line with Harrison's comparison of scientia with religio, I'd like to try and rebalance in terms of the analysis and ask this: is there any cognitive science of, quote, propensity to be a scientific realist, or perhaps a propensity to believe in energy, for example, etc.? And if not, should there be?
That's an interesting question. I mean, cognitive scientists will. I mean, I'm straying a little outside the territory that I know much about here. But I mean, cognitive scientists will certainly comment on the ways that human cognitive systems and mental tools are or aren't aligned to the physical world. Therefore, the extent to which doing science comes naturally to us. In terms of the propensity to believe that our science is reliable, or not. I just don't know how much has been sort of said or thought or speculated about that. I mean, my suspicion is that the most CSR scholars would be default scientific realists, and maybe sometimes not in a particularly reflective way. But that kind of presumption is a sort of basic condition to make their scientific investigation work. So,
right, I mean, Paul would say that most practicing scientists are critical realists.
Yeah.
So we believe there's a real world out there, that God made something real that we can't discover. So there's a sort of built-in bias to believe that there's something real there to investigate scientifically.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. And well, what's what are the sources and origins of that bias? That's an interesting question. I mean, you could certainly speculate about the way in which our cognitive systems might predispose us to be scientific realists.
In evolutionary terms, it works.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, if we're if we have cognitive systems that tell us things about the natural world, then a kind of practical working assumption has to be that they're telling us about what's really out there in some sense. But yeah, I mean, I can't say much more than that about how that's thought through or worked through in terms of cognitive science.
Okay, let's sort of follow on question here. We're going to go to a question in the audience. So if you'd like to probably
Yes,
ask a question, could you just come to the podium and use the microphone?
Okay, thank you very much. Can I take you back to the very start of your lecture, in your outlining of the basic tenets of CSR. I did my theological studies in the early 1980s, when at least I was unaware of the initial CSR, but there was a well-respected discipline called psychology of religion. And all the way through, I've been wondering to myself, to what extent is CSR, I shouldn't say simply, but a development of that in light of the burgeoning of neuroscience, and whether there are any significant step changes between an older discipline of psychology of religion and CSR as a discipline.
Yes, thanks. I think I think Barrett would say that they're kind of cognate fields of study. So there's a certain there's certainly a relationship and a kind of interface between CSR and psychology of religion, but he wouldn't say that they are the same thing, or CSR is just a subset of psychology of religion. I mean, I guess one distinctive thing about CSR is that the kind of subset of psychology that it draws on is, as its name suggests, cognitive psychology. So that the whole gamut of other psychological approaches to religion in the psychology of religion field wouldn't be so closely related to it. Of course, the other thing that's about CSR in Barrett's account is that, like cognitive science more broadly, it's a multidisciplinary field or an interdisciplinary field. So it draws in not only cognitive psychology, but also draws on neuroscience, as you suggested, draws on study of computation, draws on philosophy as well, in ways that other approaches to the psychology of religion don't necessarily. So Barrett and his colleagues would see it as a distinctive thing, but it has relationships and isn't the borderlands with the whole range of other fields, including evolutionary studies, as I mentioned, also the neuroscience of religion, which is its own thing as well, which is not certainly not identical to CSR.
But the basic tenets that we share with certainly as I understand the psychology of religion.
Maybe with some psychologists of religion and some of the tenets, but not necessarily all by all psychologists of religion. I mean, the idea that human minds are composed of discrete, specialized cognitive systems, for example. As I understand it, has been a controversial idea in psychology more widely. It's been very, very strongly promoted by evolutionary psychologists and cognitive psychologists and others, but it's also had its critics. There'd certainly be overlap with the common ground, but not necessarily agreements on all.
Thank you. Just one more question here before Rodney, you answer. Just before we lose the train of thought from the previous question, we thank you for that answer and comments that perhaps it's partly about what's deemed to need explaining in the sense that religion rather than atheism apparently needs explaining. Perhaps it's just a matter of not trusting scientists rather than being a scientific realist. But the related question then goes on to ask this: does the concept of natural law give a context for the role of CSR in religion? Something along the lines of giving us a better understanding of how things are, what is true and real, rather than using it as a basis of faith.
So I wonder. I'm wondering whether the questioner means natural law in the sense of the laws of nature, or whether they mean natural law in the sense of the kind of ethical theory that's known as natural law theory.
I would guess it's the former of the laws of nature, the existence of the fact that nature obeys laws.
Yeah. So again, well, there's a whole debate about what's meant by laws of nature anyway. Whether they are simply human constructs, human mental constructs that we sort of, as it were, impose on the world to order our knowledge of the world, or whether they are real laws out there, as it were, that's governing the way the world works, or whether there's there's something in between those two. So, I mean, again, what would CSR be committed to? Be committed to the idea that there are kind of regularities in the workings of human organisms, including human minds, and that those the way human minds work is well attuned to regularities in the way that the physical world works, though not precisely attuned to it. I mean, CSR scholars and other cognitive scientists will point out that folk physics is not the same as proper physics, and folk biology is not the same as proper biology. Sometimes our sort of quick and dirty understanding of the way that the world out there works is not entirely accurate. But the CSR is going to assume that there are reliable regularities both in there and out there. Beyond, again, a theologian reflecting on this can give reasons, give theological reasons for that regularity existing. But the CSR is not going to be committed to any sort of particular understanding of the laws of nature beyond that. And again, trying. I think that the theological interpretation that I've just sketched out is one that would come after a prior commitment to faith, rather than be part of an argument for it.
But in the sense that CSR brings in neuroscience as an ally, there's an underlying reductionism to its approaches. They're not underneath all this religious stuff. Is basically some deterministic set of laws that are determining how we react to it.
Yes, but again, there are different kinds of reductionism, and most, even among the skeptics, most CSR scholars who reflect on the implications of CSR for Christian faith are very careful to acknowledge that a natural explanation of religious belief does not explain religious belief away.
Sure, the mechanism doesn't explain the meaning.
Yeah, it would be a genetic fallacy to think that it did. That's why the skeptical arguments are slightly more indirect. They tend to go along the lines of suggesting that CSR casts doubt on the truth of religious belief by showing that the cognitive processes that generate it aren't capable of giving us the kind of reliable knowledge that we would need to affirm the truth of religious belief. They're epistemically unreliable when it comes to making supernatural claims. And that's the kind of indirect skeptical argument, of course, that I was suggesting could actually prove to be an ally for theology the way I understand it.
Yes, perhaps time for one short question and a brief answer as well. Robbie, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I suppose the thing that struck me is, what does CSR really deliver? I mean, if you take the HADD or whatever, you get some kind of primitive apprehension of a supernatural being because you're overrating it, that you think they're a lions, and you think more other things there, that gives you a better chance of your life. But then it's just so a million miles away from the Summa Theologiae, Thomas Aquinas, or Karl Barth's Church dogmatics for that. So and it's sort of like the connection between primitive people rubbing sticks in a cave and general relativity or something. What you get, I don't know. I mean, do you want to comment?
I would basically agree, and so actually would Barrett. When Barrett proposes that CSR can support this universal natural theology we're justified in assuming that our natural religious beliefs are basically reliable. I mean, he does emphasise that all he's talking about is the religious beliefs that are naturally generated by our cognitive systems. He says that more elaborated theologies or more elaborated beliefs would need further justification of a different sort. So he says that the concept of God that's generated by the interaction of a hypersensitive agency detection device and theory of mind and all the rest of it is not identical to the doctrine of the Trinity or the concept of God in Judaism or Islam, for example. But he says there's a kind of it does seem to suggest there's a kind of continuity between them. So you can start with this sort of naturally arising concept of a God, and then Christianity or Judaism or Islam will elaborate that further through theological argumentation to develop it into the idea of a transcendent creator. I want to suggest that there's not continuity, but a sharp disjunction between the naturally arising concept of a supernatural agent and the God of Christian revelation. I'd want to suggest, with reference to Barton Feuerbach, that the naturally arising God concepts that CSR theorises look quite a lot like the sort of projections that Feuerbach thought were all that God is, which Barth, of course, then said is the sort of false God that our human minds construct, and not where we ought to be starting at all if we're trying to do Christian theology.
Thank you very much, Neil. I want to thank you again on behalf of our audience and our watchers on Zoom for the challenging and stimulating talk that you've given, and I'm almost pleased to see you setting hard questions from theologians. So thank you very much for that. And, thank you to everyone who's taken part in today's discussion and for your comments and questions. Just remind you that our seminar program continues in 2 weeks' time. We'll have the last of our series in this term, and that will be given on Tuesday the 8th of March, again at 1 o'clock. Reverend Dr. Joanna Collicott, and she'll be speaking on psychosis and religious experience, so following our theme of the general area of neurosciences, cognitive science and Christian faith. So that's in 2 weeks' time, psychosis and religious experience with Joanna Collicott. We look forward to seeing you then. Thank you and goodbye.